really hope that you enjoyed that montage, because that montage, how do you say that? I don't even know. Just a bunch of different clips in there. There's some client work, there's some work for the vlog, and a bunch of random things that I included into that first minute of this video. And the reason that I included those clips in particular is because they are all shot with the exact same settings with my Sony a7 III or my Sony a7R III. And the question that I asked without a doubt the most is which camera settings you should have to get the most cinematic footage from your camera. So that is what we're going to talk about in this video. So it doesn't matter if you have a Sony camera, a Canon camera, a Panasonic, a Fuji, a Pentax, or a GoPro. The absolute biggest thing to control when you want to have cinematic looking footage is definitely going to be your exposure. When you're setting up your camera to do a shoot like this, you want to make sure that you have your camera set to manual exposure when you are in video mode. Because when you have your camera set to manual exposure, that is when you can control the ISO, you can control the shutter, and you can control the aperture. And when you're able to control all of these three settings, then you can also make sure that your shot gets the perfect exposure. Because if you were to let your camera decide what kind of exposure that you want, then it can be anything. Like, it can overexpose, it can underexpose, it can be, I don't know, like a weird white balance or something like that. And that is why you want to make sure that you have your video mode set to manual exposure. So shooting in manual exposure for the first time will definitely require a lot of practice, but it's going to be easy for you if you use the histogram, because the histogram is something that I really recommend you to get familiar with, because that is gonna save you a bunch of different times when you're out shooting and you don't know how to expose the footage. Say for example that you're shooting at sunset and then you want to expose for the sky and you want the shadows to be actually dark and you want all the details in the highlights. Then you're probably gonna have to crush the shadows. So what you want to do then is making sure that your histogram is way over to the left and then crushing those shadows down so you only get the silhouettes of the sky. But if you want to like expose only for the shadows and blow out that sky, then you want to do the complete opposite. So you want to make sure that your histogram is way over to the right. When it comes to choosing the right kind of frame rate for your video, it's going to depend on a lot of what you want to do with the video that you are shooting. Say for example that you want to slow it down to like 25%, then you want to shoot that in 100 frames per second. But if you're not going to slow it down and you know the framing and you know that you will get the shot, everything is going to be perfect, then you can shoot in 4K 25 frames per second or 24 depending on where you live. But when it comes to my sequences that I post here on YouTube, I either shoot in 100 frames or 25 frames. And if I'm shooting like a client video, then I definitely try to combine the two to make sure that I get the highest quality possible with the 4K 25 frames per second. And then when I need to be able to slow something down, that is when I go to the 100 frames per second. For example, I've been shooting an event called Action Run the last year, and when you're shooting an event, I highly recommend you to shoot in 100 frames per second, because then you have the ability to slow certain movements down when you get to the editing process. For example, if you get a shot of someone falling in 25 frames per second, then that's gotta be really hard to make something interesting of, comparing to if you got it in 100 frames per second, because then you can just like slow it down and you can make it more impactful and stuff like that. So for me personally, I try to use the 100 frames and 25 frames depending on what it is that I want to shoot and depending on what kind of quality that I want to have on my videos. And always here on YouTube, I try to shoot in 4K 25 frames per second for these kind of videos to make sure that I get the absolute best video quality that I can get from my camera. Another thing that I highly recommend you to do is to learn how to use manual focus with your camera, because manual focus can be really good if you do it right. And I highly recommend you to go and check out James Matthews and Daniel Schiffer. Those guys are they're just crazy with the cameras, and both of them are really good, and they are actually the reason why I started shooting more with manual focus. And when you're shooting in manual focus, you definitely have to plan your shots a lot more than if you're not shooting in manual focus. Because if I shoot like a small cinematic sequence, then I usually try to use manual focus, but if I am shooting an event, I try to use autofocus to make sure that I don't have to like twist and turn the focus ring all the time when I'm shooting the actual event. And I mean, like, the autofocus in today's cameras is actually really good, so you can use that and be satisfied with that. But I do recommend you to actually try to use manual focus because it's really fun and it can give you some really interesting shots. And when you're shooting in manual focus, something that I use a whole lot is something that is called focus peaking, because the focus peaking basically shows on your display where you have the focus. So if you're shooting a lot running gun, like on the go, that is a really good thing to have in your camera. And it works really good for me, but I do know that Daniel Schiffer doesn't use it at all, which is, come on, man. Like, why are you not using that? And how are you possibly getting those kind of shots without using focus peaking? I have no clue. You also want to make sure that you are shooting in a flat color profile when you are shooting your footage, because shooting in a flat color profile will make your footage look so much better when you get into the editing process. And it's going to be really hard in the beginning when you start using S-Log or C-Log or any kind of log profile, because they look really washed out and you don't really know how to expose them and you don't really know how to color grade them. But when you get the hang of it and how they actually work, you can get some really good shots with that color profile. And you're also going to get like way more dynamic range when you're shooting in one of those profiles than if you're shooting, like, say, in the standard profile. And if you're shooting with a Sony camera, I will post my exact settings to my S-Log profile that I use for all my videos in the description below. So you can just go there, you can set up your own camera, and then you're ready to go. So when you got all of those things down and know how to actually expose your footage and have the right frame rate set depending on what it is that you're gonna shoot, and making sure that you have the right focus mode and the right picture profile, that is gonna give you really cinematic footage no matter what camera that you got. But the main thing that you gotta focus on is definitely gonna be the exposure, because good exposure, good lighting is everything when it comes to shooting videos and photos. So I really hope that you liked this video and that you learned something from it. And if you did, make sure you give it a thumbs up because it does help a lot. So thank you so much for that. And if you haven't subscribed yet, that'd be highly appreciated.